Welcome everyone to Cantus Firmus at the Movies. This is Cody, and my special guest today is Lenny Esposito. Lenny is an author and speaker who's been spreading convincing Christianity across the globe by stirring the hearts and minds of the lost and the church for 20 years. A pioneer in online apologetics with his popular comereason.org website and podcast, Lenny has also contributed to books such as the award-winning Apologetic Study Bible for Students, A New Kind of Apologist, and True Reason, Confronting the Irrationality of the New Atheism. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this is because I understand you actually do have a special sort of interest in the use of film for apologetics and film in the service of the gospel, those kinds of issues. And could you kind of elaborate a little bit on what you've done in that area and what your interest is?
Yeah, I think film is really important nowadays because it's one of the last cultural touchstones that we have. Art has always served to be a medium of communication that bridges generations, it bridges cultures, and it bridges different even economic spectrums. But we have lost a lot of that in even music is now kind of segmented and fragmented, and everybody's their own DJ. You don't have a common referent. Film is one of those last things, though, that we all share, that everyone can understand. So if I were to come up to someone and quote a line from a band that was popular when I was a teenager, kids today may get it, they may not get it. But if I was to come up and say, Luke, I am your father, everybody knows what that reference means. And they have an amount of understanding as to what it implies emotionally, what it implies in terms of context. And so we can use the ideas in film in very powerful ways as a common language that really unites us. And it doesn't have a whole lot of baggage tied with it yet. So I think it's one of those ways we can break down the barriers between all the different silos that have come up. Are you this person or that kind of person? Do you fit in this category or that category? Film kind of is one of the ways we can talk across categories and really get ideas across, because that's what they do. They hold and transmit ideas very well.
I'd be interested in, and I think we'll probably be talking about this a little bit later in the discussion, sort of talking about film as kind of a cultural touchstone that's kind of across the board, kind of regardless of what subculture you fit into. It'd be interesting to hear how you view where this idea of Christian movies sort of fits into this. So maybe that's something we'll get into as we go forward.
We may, because the two films we're talking about today, one it kind of falls in the Christian genre camp, and one doesn't. Believe it or not, even though both of them are saturated with biblical concepts. So I think that's a clear, and back in my day, I mean, Christian film, quote unquote, is a relatively small pool. In the 70s, what you had the whole The Thief in the Night series, which is, by anybody's standards, not a barrier that's hard to, leap above. So
sure. Well, I was going to say the late great Planet Earth at the very least had Orson Welles narrating it, so that was there's something there.
But then you go back before that, really, and like all of art. I mean, you have Cecil B. DeMille in Ten Commandments. You have Ben-Hur. You have in the Bells of St. Mary. There are, in the early years of film, just like in the early years of most art, the church drove a lot of the ideas there. And as it became more immersed in the secular culture, of course, then that kind of fell away and we lost some of that. But it's interesting now that just like Christian music is no longer written by the J.S. Bachs of the world, it's a subcategory, and some people consider it somewhat lesser than popular mainstream music, and Christian film a lot of times just does not hit the level of quality that some of the mainstream films that you would see.
I'd be interested in getting into that a little bit more maybe as we kind of move forward talking about these two films. So we're talking about two films that were both made in the last year. One was directed by Martin Scorsese, and it's called Silence, based on a book by Shusaku Endo, a Japanese Catholic writer. Shack, which is based on a book by William Paul Young. And the director of that isn't as well known. I kind of checked his IMDb. He's got a couple credits under his belt. His name is Stuart Hazeldine. And I'd be interested, which one would you actually like to talk about first, Lenny?
Well, let's start. I saw The Shack before I saw Silence.
Okay.
So I'll take these in order. And when I sat down to watch these films, I didn't watch them as a critic, or I didn't seek to sit down and outline all the theological flaws. That wasn't my initial goal. I wanted to approach each of them as a film goer would, because I think that's the best way to judge them from an audience perspective. So I want to caveat my comments with that. But to say still that there's a stark difference between the two. With The Shack, it started off interesting. I thought that the tale of Mac, and as he's a child, and I'm not sure that the him poisoning his father, I don't know if that's in the book or not, or if that's an adaptation just for the film.
Yeah.
But
because I've read both of these books. The Shack has been longer, but it seemed like a lot of the stuff that was happening in the beginning of the movie from the book. I don't particularly don't remember the neighbor who is kind of used as a model later for Papa.
Yeah,
right. From the book, I know there's discussion of him having a tough relationship with his father in the book, but I don't remember all these details in the film.
Right.
But maybe before we start discussing those, maybe I'll give just a really quick overview of the plot.
Sure.
It is spoilery, so if you haven't seen the film and want it to be a surprise, then you might want to check later. But so the basic premise is Mac is the main character. He's sort of struggled to relate to God, and particularly because of issues he's had growing up with his father. And he experiences this great loss when his young daughter Missy is murdered by some sort of drifting criminal serial killer. Sometime after, he receives a letter from God in his mailbox asking him to come to the shack where Missy was killed. And while he's there, he talks with each member of the Trinity. God the Father presents himself as a black woman to break through the negative associations that Mac has with his own abusive father. And they help Mac to learn to forgive and to see God as loving instead of uncaring and punishing. The Cliff's Notes version of the film.
There you go.
Yeah. So okay. So now, what were you kind of going to comment about?
So
how you felt watching it?
Well, watching it, I would say that in summary, I would say The Shack was a very 21st century American cultural reflection of God. It felt very much almost a prisoner of our modern biases. It was very individualistic about Mac, about his needs. God was there working on him to help him overcome his difficulties. And I know there's a lot of controversy with the book and subsequently the film. How the Trinity is portrayed. Do you portray the Trinity as one person or three persons? Or does that mean one being or three beings? Are we talking about modalism? Some of this is a difficulty that you will struggle with in film. Does God being portrayed, God the Father, is that heresy? Well, I wouldn't quite go that far, that it's heretical in and of itself, because as you say, the film softens that approach by making God the Father appear as a person who gave Mac comfort in his childhood years. So it's not, the film almost soft soaps the representation of God the Father from the book by saying this is just a representation. It isn't truly who God is, and it's not truly how he looks. And of course, even in the film, there's a scene where, God, you're going to now need a father. And so he Papa shows up as a man, an elder man, in order to go through this one piece. But my overall impression of it was it's very much on kind of a psychological idea of healing, of forgiveness, and things like that, things that are very valued in the 21st century church, just because the 21st century culture values those things as well. What it missed, and what I think it did poorly with it by being so entrapped in its culture, it never got around to showing the holiness of God, the what it means to be a fallen creature, how we all have the capacity for evil, what my friend Clay Jones calls, we are all Auschwitz enabled. And it not, sometimes it downplays that, sometimes it right out denies it when Mac asks God, well, what about all this stuff about you and wrath? And God in turn looks back at him and says, I don't know what you're talking about. You know, that's a absolute refutation of the God of the Bible. That I would say is heretical, because it mischaracterizes who God is and things like that. So that was my initial impression of The Shack. If I could draw a comparison to another film that I saw, and granted, I saw this film when I was 9 years old, so it was a long time ago, but the feeling I got from The Shack was very much the feeling I got from Jonathan Livingston Seagull. It was this self-improvement, spiritual, spiritually wrapped, motivational,
kind of a therapeutic gospel.
Yeah. So that was, and I don't know if nobody recommends Jonathan Livingston Seagull. It's a whole bunch of New Age claptrap. And I was 9 when I saw it, so I have just, I don't have perfect recollection on the whole thing, but the overall vibe, the feel of it was very much kind of that approach.
Well, you talked a little bit about this kind of idea that it's sort of a slave to its own kind of limited viewpoint in the film.
Yes.
And I noticed that I've kind of got in my notes that I kind of took as I was watching it, that sort of, I didn't actually write that that explicitly, but as I'm looking through my notes, I'm seeing where I was kind of seizing on that idea, that problem. Certain themes that come up a lot. There's this idea of religion versus relationship, religion is slavery to rules, and relationship is love. There's kind of a God just wants to love on you sort of thing. I think this idea, like you said, the sort of positive denial of God's wrath. I mean, is God a judge at all? Does God judge? Or it doesn't seem that that's something that happens in this particular world.
Right.
I think there's
the problem is William Young, and he's come out in other writings. He's a universalist. He doesn't hold to this idea that some people will be damned for all eternity. He tends to believe that there may be those who hell is a place of purging that will maybe open their eyes to see the glory of God. But he does believe that all people will eventually spend life in a paradise state with God, which is, so his theology kind of comes through in the film in that way. And I think that's a problem. Let me give you a for instance. I was at a Starbucks several years ago, and a woman was at a table reading The Shack. She was reading the book. And as I'm wont to do, I walk up to her and I start a conversation saying, oh, tell me about what you're reading. Oh, this is a great book. This is a book all about the relationship that we can have with God and how Jesus' love for us and things like that. I said, well, that's interesting. Do you go to church? Oh, yes, I go to this church here. And this is why I love my church, because my pastor talks about this all the time. And I believe this. I believe how important it is for us to have this relationship with God and to grow with God. And as I'm talking with her, I notice that she's using all of what I call this catchphrase Christianity, these bumper sticker slogans about what we should do. So I asked her, I said, well, can you tell me why it's important for us to have a relationship with God? And she says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I have a lot of relationships. I get, fulfillment in my relationship with my wife, for example. I have fulfillment through my relationship with my children. I have friends, I have family. Why do I need a relationship with Jesus? And she said, well, it's like, I don't know, my pastor can say it so much. Anyway, she was stumbling over the problem. she never once mentioned sin. She never once mentioned atonement. She never once mentioned the fact that we are beings, that hold the curse of Adam. And she had all the platitudes, and the relationship sounded really nice, but without the other stuff, it starts to make me wonder, is she truly saved or not? And this is one of the problems with our culture, is we can sound good, sound loving, talk about relationship instead of religion. And all of that's really easy, but you say, well, why do I need relationship? And a lot of people just, unless you come down to atonement, unless you come down to the propitiation for sin and things of that nature, then you'll be, you're not talking about the gospel anymore. And the shack was it bent over backwards to show a soft, loving God, that I don't know that it truly answered all of the questions that it even set out to ask. Some of the time it didn't even ask the questions. Didn't ask any of the questions about natural evil, for example. It only talked about moral evil, about man's inhumanity to man. Never talked about the idea of earthquakes or why, children are born with spina bifida or things of that nature.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. Well, another thing I kind of noticed, and I'll admit this is, certainly a concern and a problem, and, one that I think about a lot, but it's also the kind of problem that is going to be talked a lot in our particular age, our kind of post-Christian era. And theme that's in the film is this idea that bad Christians make God look bad, kind of thing. Often, sometimes the case, more often than I'd like to say, but it's interesting that it becomes a major theme in this film when you look at all the other themes that are there. That, God is sort of, distancing himself from the church a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think there's other things that sort of come through just stylistically, not even really theologically, but like, for example, stuff doesn't really tip you off to where William Paul Young is coming from. I think some of the language that's in the film, or particularly in the book, not as much in the film, but in the book, definitely, and certainly some in the film, there's these kinds of ways of speaking about things that are, I don't exactly know how to say it, but there's kind of a theatricality to the speech at times. So, this is supposed to be a family of working class whites, but they talk more like they're coffee drinking emergent authors. They use phrases like the great sadness, and, they call God Papa and things like that just sort of they don't really feel real. Like they don't seem down to earth at all. And it's kind of interesting because I read The Shack, and my mom did too. My mom's, I don't exactly know where I'd say my mom is as far as her faith is concerned at this point, but she watched Silence with me, and she read The Shack, and she really liked Silence a lot, and she hated The Shack.
Interesting.
And I think, there's perhaps part of it is that she's maybe a bit more hardened in her approach. She's not necessarily sentimental, but I feel like there's something in this film that in The Shack that sort of appeals to those who are a little bit more sentimental. Right. I don't want to say surface level, but it's tough to say because there's this other kind of question that I think we're going to kind of get out of this, which is, what really makes a good movie or a bad movie? I mean, I know somebody who, or know of somebody, a friend of a friend who saw this movie right after she had lost her daughter, and she thought it was very encouraging and helpful. And I don't want to say, well, you're wrong. You know what I mean? Like, so, the fact that the film is, has some good points, but also is kind of tried at times, or maybe, are aesthetically kind of weak. I mean, how do we assess that? I mean, what do we call a good movie? What's the point of art? And, what level can we say this is not really that good if we actually see that it might be useful for some people?
Well, I mean, it can be useful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's helpful to use it in any aspect. Because if you bring in two wrong ideas along with three right ones, a little leaven leavens the whole lump, as Paul has want to say. And that's the part that concerns me. Unless you are really good at discerning and you can talk through some of these things, in that sense, you could talk through some of these things, and it could be useful. There were some ideas in there that were valuable. There were some ideas in there. Well, some of the creative aspects were heavy-handed and trite. I mean, go with Jesus and see, he's out in the workshop and see some of the stuff he's working on. And what do? You get in a boat and you look up at the stars. Oh yeah, I made the Pleiades over here, and stuff like that. I just thought was a little, the cheese factor rose to a little bit high level there. The other thing, but things that bothered me was when he starts questioning the Father, saying, "Where were you when Jesus was on the cross?" And Olivia, I can't remember her last name, the actress who played.
Oh, Octavia Spencer.
Octavia Spencer, I'm sorry. Yeah. Octavia Spencer plays Papa, shows her wrists, and her wrists have marks in them, scars in them. And while it's true that it did cost the Father something to give the Son, that's not it. The scars belong to Jesus because Jesus was the only one who was incarnated. The Father, what it cost the Father was his child, which is a bigger wound than any scars on any hands would show. And they missed that. That's when they start getting into modalism. That's when you have the heresy start to show up in representing who God is, because the Father does not bear the marks of the cross in his person in that respect.
So yeah, and I think that was something that I remember hearing a lot about debate about during the book, and I don't remember how the book framed it up. I don't know if the film attempted to maybe reframe that, because as I watched the film, I could see where that could be viewed as modalism or kind of a patripassianism. To be clear, for those who don't know what that means, modalism is this idea that they're not really three persons in the Trinity, but that God sort of takes on different personas depending on the task that he's trying to accomplish. So there's really only one person. But the way I understood that was it was supposed to be a kind of a way physically to represent the idea that, God so identifies with the suffering that it's almost as if, the Father was crucified with the Son. And I don't know that I don't know that I wouldn't say that's modalism, but I think that it definitely created an impression for a lot of folks that was what he was getting at. And I'm not sure if that's what it was trying to say.
Maybe, but I think a more powerful approach would have been, would you have taken your daughter's place? In other words, same conversation at the same time. Would you have taken your daughter's place and died instead of her? Yes. So what costs you more? Her being taken from you, or your own life being? Don't think that it didn't cost me anything to give up my only son. See, that's all they had to do. That's all they had to do. And they missed that opportunity.
Yeah. So. Well, it's very tough. I think that this is a constant issue of consternation for theologians are, poor visual representations or metaphors for the Trinity and the relationship that they have. And certainly.
And like I said, I don't necessarily mind Octavia Spencer and having the Holy Spirit. I like the way the book approached Seinu better, whereas he could never actually focus on the person of who she is. She was always, you catch a little better glimpse of it out of the corner of your eye than looking head on, that kind of idea.
Sure.
Which was kind of an interesting concept. And so I was, like any good film, a superhero film or anything else, you give a certain amount of license to the film, understanding that it's a limited medium and it has to make exceptions, or there are certain laws of physics that aren't going to work, or what have you, depending on whatever the genres you're talking about. But when you take excessive abuse of that license, that's where the problems come in any film. And Christian films, more often than not, will always take too much license with how human beings actually react. Everybody gets saved at the end of God's Not Dead, or they all happen to show up all at the same place at the same time. And this is where you get these wooden caricatures as opposed to a real world example of how people are. And that's one of the criticisms of, quote, Christian film, is everybody thinks they got to tie up everything in a nice, neat bow, and but human beings are messy.
Sure. Well, and and I felt like you kind of talked about early on in the film was perhaps more interesting to you, and I'm with that completely. I mean, I think I was kind of following along. I was with it. I felt, Mac's pain. I sort of identified with what was happening. I was able to sympathize or empathize, whichever the one is when you're not in their shoes, but you can relate. And but as soon as he gets into the shack and he starts talking with God, I feel like that's where things really kind of break down. And I don't envy the task of filmmakers having to express something as complex as the perichoretic relationship of the members of the Trinity, but it feels like an episode of Full House. They kind of look at each other and laugh a lot, and it's just real kind of dopey. I don't
dancing to pop music and saying how God enjoys Neil Young and things like that. You're going, really? Kind of, what is it? What does that even do? Is that to show that you're him?
Yeah.
Now, here's the interesting thing. Yeah. There is an account in the Bible of what would happen if this kind of thing actually happened in real life. And it's in the book of Job. And God doesn't behave in any way, shape, or form the way he behaves in the shack. I mean, what does he ask? He says, who is this that darkens the counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man, and I will question you, and you will make it known to me, right? And God over and over says, shall the fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, and let him answer. So what God does is say, you know so much. Where were you when I did this? Tell me how this works. If you're so, God doesn't sit there and say, you're my personal. Now, I believe that God works in all of our lives, but I think another misunderstanding that could come out of this film is that God should pay special attention to my pain and do something extraordinary to help me heal. That it's almost his responsibility to reach out to me because I'm in pain. This is one of the problems of the shack when it's trying to answer the problem of pain and the problem of suffering. It's actually giving a representation that says you can be the passive one and God will kind of work it through for you.
That's kind of, you raise an important point, which is that God seemed to not care in the film. God seemed to not care enough to save Missy, but he went out of his way to arrange this meeting in the cabin in the shack with Mac in order to sort of deal with all of his inner turmoil.
Right.
And it seems kind of strange. And actually, and you talked about how when God is sort of dealing with these questions in Job, but another account maybe that people might identify with a little more, or find a little more appealing, is what does God look like when he takes on flesh and interacts with human beings? It's more complex. I mean, you do have Jesus weeping over the death of Lazarus. And he answers questions related to theodicy. These young men who a tower falls on and kills, and they say, "Well, was it because they were particularly bad sinners?" And he says, "No, but if you don't, if you continue to sin, then something worse will happen to you." And so there is a more complex representation of God in Scripture than is in this film, and certainly has an awful lot to do with a certain cultural outlook.
Right.
That sort of is placed upon God.
We miss the idea that when Jesus said, he who has seen me has seen the Father, because that's what Philip asked. And we miss, again, that we don't need the Father personified. I mean, because what did Moses ask? Moses asked to see God and says, you'll die. When Isaiah was brought before God's throne and saw the holiness of God, his first reaction, again, was one of total awareness of his own sin. Woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips and a people of unclean lips. When Jesus unveils himself, right, and calms the sea, anytime there's this representation of even a slight unveiling of God's holiness, the natural reaction of human beings is to cower in fear, because we realize that that's not us. There's the separation, there's the distinction, there's the difference. And boy, are we evil. Boy, are we in need of a Savior. Boy, are we, depart from me, Lord, I am a sinful man. That's the proper reaction to a holy God. It's nowhere in this film, not at all, not even a smidge do I see anybody falling on their face before a holy God in that regard. I see God as my friend, God as my buddy, which harkens back again to that lady I talked about in the coffee shop. And that's a comfortable God. That's a safe God. God can be your buddy. Heck, I had Jehovah's Witnesses over last Sunday who told me that God is, God should be your friend, and you want to listen to the advice that your friend gives you. And I sat stunned going, it's amazing how shallow their view of God is, to think of him only as in that regard. Yeah. And if we miss the holiness of God, then we miss the heinousness of evil. And both of those answer the problem of suffering.
Well, and so I kind of want to mention one thing that I thought I didn't really understand it. It didn't make a lot of sense, but it did remind me of maybe a better film on this subject, which is that there's the scene where they take him to find Missy's body, and then she's buried in this garden that the Holy Spirit is kind of tending, which is him, I guess, apparently.
Right.
They bury her, and this tree starts growing over it. And it reminded me of, did you ever see Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring?
No, I haven't seen that.
It's kind of a similar thing where a young girl is killed, and there's a sort of grappling with theodicy and, where is God and all this kind of thing. But anyway, the spot where she's killed, they're like the spring starts to form. And so it's kind of a similar imagery. But that is the thing, though, as I watch it, what really is this particular theodicy or justification of God or answer to the problem of evil, that the film is really, I feel like I catch pieces of it, but I have trouble putting it together. All the pieces don't really fit.
Yeah.
And, so there's, for example, would you have expected that the judgment scene, which is probably the closest scene to Job's conversation with God, that judgment scene where he's sort of invited to sit on the seat of judgment.
Right, and not even from God, from wisdom, which is a personification in Proverbs. They're pulling from Proverbs 8. So.
Yeah. But he's sort of talked into not judging God on this rationale that, everybody's bad and you could pretty much judge everybody. And so, I guess that means you shouldn't be mad at God for letting your daughter die.
Yeah,
and I was like,
it was really flashbacks to Jim Carrey. I mean, it was that scene there. That's what I almost took it. Oh, you think you could be God for a week? Here you go. Let's try it and see what happens. And that was a comedy. That's what I say. It's like even with the African American woman, right? It's like, well, if you've seen Oh God with George Burns, there was a scene where he's supposed to be God, and then John Denver tries to point out, hey, this is God, and it turns out he appears as an African American woman. And so there's I don't know if that's subconscious. But it's again, these tried things they're kind of trite, they're kind of cliche, they're kind of like trod upon ideas, which is the exact opposite, I would say, of a film like Silence, because Silence talks about suffering as well, but it doesn't have to be a evil child molester takes your daughter. I mean, again, these are such extreme caricatures of, right, your dad is an alcoholic and a wife beater and ties you to a tree all night long, and make sure you really hate him, right? And that's just easy to paint it that way. Or your the person that the ladybug you have to forgive is a child abuser and murders a 7-year-old. I think a more interesting question is, where is God when the people who are standing up for him, when the faithful are being martyred because of their faithfulness? And that's one of the things I appreciated about Silence. And this is, again, the difference between kind of a director like Scorsese, who's not trying to pander to an audience, to preach to the choir, or to make a quote Christian film so that Christians will come and see it, but he's making a film that expresses some of his understanding of Roman Catholicism and his faith in that regard.
Well, and Scorsese made a brilliant movie that seemed to have alienated both secular people and Christians.
That's right. He did that very well with, and some people said that this was his repentance. So I don't know if I don't know if Scorsese figures in on Kikuchiro. Is that his stand-in for him? I don't know, but I'm not gonna. But it is a more deft, and it raises more questions about personally, how would I be in these situations? How would I react to others in that, seeing them? How would I react if I myself were as Andrew Garfield finds himself ultimately? So it was a much weightier film. You can't just write it off as something that's a cliche.
Sure, yeah, that doesn't try to give simple answers that would fit on Starbucks cups.
Right.
To just very complicated, difficult questions. It doesn't have the agenda I think that The Shack does. But I'll mention one more thing, just from a film going perspective. Sam Worthington, who plays Mac, I think does a pretty good job.
Yeah.
But was it as obvious to you as it was to me that he was actually Australian? Because it feels like there's a lot of places where he breaks out of his American accent and goes right into Australian.
Yeah, he had a little trouble in some of the whispers and things like that. It's but I've been actually pretty impressed at the number of English actors and Australian, New Zealand folks who have started to master the American accent, because I would say 20 years ago that just wasn't the case. Americans, and we don't know. We thought that the Americans could do a fairly decent English accent, but the other way, it was always evident. You could always hear it. It's gotten so much better now that sometimes you get surprised when you hear a Hugh Jackman talk or somebody like that. So, but yeah, this wasn't one of them. This wasn't one where you were surprised.
Did you want to say anything else about The Shack before we maybe move on to Silence?
No, I think overall that's, in summary, the flaws of the book are pulled through to the film. I just don't know that you can do that. But the film, while it maybe tries to soften a couple of the clear controversies that had arisen within the church, it doesn't do anything that the book already did. No, there's nothing that it accomplishes that you couldn't get from reading the book. It's the same easy, fuzzy heart story in both instances. And so I don't know that the film adds anything other than the fact that people who may not sit and read the book will sit and watch a 2-hour film because it's quick.
Sure.
That's the only thing that I could think of that might make a difference. But that's a horrible reason. If you're really looking for ideas, read the books. The books are the more important. Yeah. So.
That's kind of like becoming an annihilationist, but not converting to Christianity, because at the very least you don't have to suffer in hell forever.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So with Silence, I might want to do kind of a plot outline too, and I'm going to try to make this really quick. I actually have I spent a page writing out, just because there's so much that happens, and I don't want to. They don't really need to go into every detail, but yeah. I'll be kind of brief. So the film takes place in the kind of early to mid 1600s. Most of the action takes place.
There was an actual historical persecution of Christians. This is a historical novel. Although the novel's fiction, it's set in a historical time where the hidden Christians were persecuted to this degree. And so a lot of it, while the individuals, may not have existed, the goings on did exist.
Yeah. Well, actually, and there are some of the characters are specifically based on real life figures as well. I know that Rodriguez and Inoue, the governor inquisitor, are both based on actual persons that existed. Okay. But and actually, it's kind of interesting you mentioned that. It is based in fact. And after I read Silence a couple of years ago, I read Gulliver's Travels. And there's a place later on in Gulliver's Travels where he's in Japan. I think he pretends that he's Portuguese instead of British because the British aren't allowed in Japan. And there's this discussion of them like sort of checking him for sacred objects and letting him know that if he's a Christian trying to smuggle things in, he'll be killed or whatever. So it was really interesting to see this, book written, a few hundred years ago discussing the same topic. But so anyway, so the film takes place in 1633, or it opens at that point. Liam Neeson's character is a Jesuit missionary named Father Ferreira, and so they established this mission in Japan. And we open with him seeing these Japanese Christians being tortured. And then we learn in the next scene that he's reported to have apostatized. And two young Jesuit missionaries who were his pupils. One is played by Andrew Garfield. He's the main monk. His name is Rodriguez, and the other is Adam Driver. And Adam Driver plays Francisco Garupe. So they don't believe this rumor. They want to go investigate it. They hire a Japanese man named Kichijiro. It's kind of hard. I'm gonna have to say that a few times before it comes out nicely. But so he's apparently a Christian who was publicly apostatized when his family was killed by inquisitors. They hire him as their guide. Anyway, they end up sort of being involved in two different Japanese Christian communities, and they're sort of hiding by cover of night. So they sort of split up to try to hide from the inquisitors. But both of them are eventually captured. What Rodriguez learns is that they've seized on this method of torture that's different than what he'd expected. He expected that they would say, we will torture you and kill you unless you repent or you recant. And he says, he's like, well, I'm fine with that. He sort of grows up in this sort of Catholic notion of, the kind of the glory of persecution and that kind of thing. But what he doesn't expect is that they have taken on this new approach, which is they will Japanese Christians and kill them if he doesn't recant. So he discovers that was the technique they used against Liam Neeson's character, Father Ferreira. And he is asked to stamp on an icon of Christ. And in the book, they talk about this more. This image of Christ is so sort of central for him, for his life and his devotion. And he's throughout this film, he's seeing all this persecution. He wonders why God is silent. But at that moment, Christ calls out to him from the icon, asking him to trample on his face, claiming that is the reason that he came in the world, to be trampled. So he does so. We see later in the epilogue that he's basically assimilated as a Japanese. He's working for the government, presumably living as a Buddhist. But when he dies, his Japanese wife that they give him places a crucifix in his hands while he's in his coffin, suggesting that she understood that he had remained a Christian throughout his life, despite professing otherwise. So that's the basic kind of outline of what happens in the film. And I'll mention just a couple things that I remembered. I kind of remember the book, but I didn't really check this before I read it. I think in the book, Inoue was raised as a Christian, which is why he is given this insight into how to persecute the church, is to sort of use their love for each other against them. And I could be mistaken about that, but I feel like I remember reading that was the case. So in any case, so it's what were your feelings watching the film?
Well, again, immediately, it was a much deeper film in that regard, and it was a much more sacred film. There's a difference, and I grew up Roman Catholic, but I hold to evangelicalism, Protestant evangelicalism today. But there's still a difference in tenor and tone that the modern church can miss. So while tilt-up buildings and high school gymnasiums can service as churches, there's not the same impact as walking into a cathedral. And that's the difference between these two films. One is very familiar. It's a familiar place. On Sunday, it may be church because we have Christian garb around it, but on Monday, it's where we eat our lunch at school. Whereas the other one, you always talk in hushed tones. You never run. You're always bowing in reverence, right? In these, and the films pulled those same kind of appeals out to me in this instance. Silence did a very good job. It reminded me, if The Shack was Jonathan Livingston Seagull, Silence reminded me a lot of Black Robe, and those are the two comparatives that I would say, because it talked about God as real, it talked about God as holy, and it talked about God as someone worthy of our sacrifice and worthy of understanding that the next life is where the Christian's eyes should be fixed and not on the life today and the pain today. It held the Japanese martyrs in high esteem. And of course, looking back at it from someone who studied kind of a bit of Christian history and the martyrdom that's happened throughout the ages of the church, Silence reflected a truer nature of Christian persecution and Christian suffering and what suffering means in the Christian worldview than I would say The Shack did. As in terms of Christianity as a whole, taken as a whole. I thought the questions that it raised were fascinating. I thought that the Kikichiro character, who was a person who would deny God and come back and wish to repent, right? And he asked for confession, and then he denied God again and asked for confession. And you start to get a little disdain for this individual until, and of course, these are all spoilers now, until you find out that Father Ferreira and Father Rodriguez, ultimately, they apostatized because of the weight of the deaths of these people that are upon them. Now, in that aspect, I don't know what the history is in Japan, if there were priests who apostatized. I know that in the early days of the church, there were bishops. There was a whole controversy about this. Bishops in North Africa who had apostatized over a huge persecution, but then had come back to the church. Can they, or if they didn't come back to the church, were the sacraments that they gave away, the marriage and the baptism, were those authentic? Because the person who gave that blessing is now an apostate. And so these are real world issues that actually really happened in the church. And it was fascinating to see. I didn't expect Rodriguez to apostatize at the end. I would have expected something different. And I think some of the reviews, if I remember right, of the film, they almost said that the film was too perfect. It made everything too nice and clean. And I'm like, what are you talking about? The main character didn't stay true to his faith. It was like, or did he? And so that's the question. But clearly in the annals of church history, those who would stand strong in the faith. If you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, for example, it's those who would stand strong in faith, even in the faith of others. I mean, there's an incredible story in the early chapters of Fox's Book of Martyrs of a Christian daughter being tied to a stake, and she's going to be tortured. I think maybe even burned alive, and the mother tells her, don't cry, daughter, know that Christ is in heaven and your ultimate glory is there. And this is the mother watching her daughter that's going to be, suffering for the sake of the faith. That's the nature of Christian martyrdom. And that's the one thing. So I was a little surprised at the twist that Rodriguez has. In that sense, and I would have almost thought that he would have rather killed himself in order to remove the motive for slaying the peasants, rather than just apostatize. I was expecting someone to drop down and kiss the icon, as opposed to only showing them putting their feet on it. I also understand, and again, this is what I love about Scorsese, because he doesn't have to explain everything. If you understood how important iconography was to most people across most ages, you would get what a big deal it is to just do something like that, to put your foot on the little 4 inch by 8 inch, brass relief of Jesus. That would be a big deal. Now he kind of hinted at it, that they all wanted the rosary beads that he had, right? Any kind of something tangible that they could take away. And Garfield's character even says, that worried me, that they're so into the item as opposed to, but that's the way most cultures are. That's why even in the Catholic Church, relics became a big deal in the 3rd and 4th century, because they were tangible symbols of an intangible faith. And
Well,
I think it's interesting that what his temptation is them saying, well, it's just a formality. It's just a nothing, right? It's no big deal. You're just stamping on a piece of, but they know it is a big deal. Otherwise they wouldn't be killing people for it. Yeah. It's gotta be a big deal. But isn't that the way temptation works? Isn't that the way compromise happens? By justification, by saying, well, this isn't as big a sin as others have made it out to be. I can just do this and still retain my faith. And the end of the film, I thought, left really solid questions of what does it mean to be faithful? Is it the 4 guys who died on the crosses in the ocean? Or is it the one who lives out his life identifying, smuggled Christian items in their imports, and then dies with a hidden cross in his hand? Mm-hmm. So I thought it was it probed a lot of issues, and it did a really good job of talking about suffering from that perspective.
Yeah, I kind of jotted that down in my notes as perhaps a theme, which is, as I watched this film, maybe it comes from me being sort of more Protestant, but what I kind of written down was this theme of the danger of faith that depends upon institutions and icons. And what Rodriguez does say exactly is, I worry that they value these poor signs of faith more than faith itself. And it seems like that all this action that happens and all this drama is driven on this premise that there's a need for priests in order for the church to function, and kind of a fear of sort of this impious symbolic action. And that's what gives the oppressors power. But right. The film seems to suggest that Christ icons and sacraments, even if they are useful in some sense, but in the poor and the weak, which is why he became one of them. That felt like where the film was maybe going to me. I don't know if you, coming back from more of a Catholic background, maybe you saw that differently, but.
Well, and more than a Catholic background, we've lost this is what I talk about, the poverty of our modern culture. We've lost the concept of how important ritual is in our day. So this is why when you became a Christian in the New Testament, you were baptized immediately. Baptism played such an integral role. It's like saying, I want to be married, but I really don't want to go through a marriage ceremony, or I don't want to. I tell people, who ask, is it being baptized really important? I said, well, what would you think if your soon-to-be spouse would say, well, I want to marry you, but I really don't want anyone to kind of know, and I'm not going to put my ring on. I don't want to have any outward symbols of it. I just want to be married to you. You'd start to doubt what their commitment level actually is. Like, what? Why? And with people in the ancient world and really all the way up until modern times, this going through ritual, having certain symbols, having a recollection of these things was important. It was part of how we reflect our inner understanding. Even Roger Scruton talks about how the cathedrals were built with the intention that when you walk into them, you would speak in hushed tones. You would see that this is a place of grandeur and of glory to God, and you should then react in that way. And today we're just almost so casual with our faith that we miss it. So part of this I saw as just a reflection of the normal life and times, especially of a culture like Japan that is not Westernized, it's not Anglicized. Of course, they're going to relate in ways of iconic understanding, where there's a Buddha statue in every house. So holding a cross or something like that would mean something to them. Doesn't mean, now, again, we caution that with, as you mature in your Christianity and you have liberty and you understand that idols are nothing, right? We have that whole explanation in 1 Corinthians about meat being sacrificed to idols, and idols really, they're sacrificing them to statues, and statues don't do anything. So don't ask where the meat comes from and eat it. There's some of that, but there is it is a way of communicating that is not necessarily verbal, but it is visual, which is what film is as well. So I didn't have as big a problem, seeing the icons. I just saw it as a limitation of their time, just like we have certain limitations in our time that we may be blind to in other ways.
Sure. Well, and yeah, so I think about, how on one level, when they, when in the book of Acts, they would ask Paul, what do I do? What do I do to be saved? And he'd say, repent and be baptized.
Right.
But yet he also wrote in Romans and Galatians and Ephesians that you're saved by grace through faith. Right. And so there's this one level that Paul acknowledges that these things are necessary because they're part of the faith. They're part of what it means to come into the faith. These rituals are here. They bring us sort of out of the profane and into the sacred. But at the same time, those aren't the things that actually save you. So there's middle ground between our kind of secular age, as Charles Taylor describes it, where there's no longer a distinction between the sacred and the profane, but everything is profane or secular or normal, whatever you want to call it. Sort of other side, which goes too far in the other direction, and I did sort of feel like as I watched it, if it weren't for this perspective on icons that they had, this movie would kind of be a non-starter because nothing would be able to really flow through in that way. Same thing with the necessity of the priests. For them, for the Japanese, if we get rid of the priests, then we've stamped out Christianity because first of all, these people need the priests in order to celebrate observe the sacraments, in order to continue in their faith. And so you have a Christianity that is dependent upon institutions. And, if Japan is a swamp, which is the language that's used in the film, that Christianity can't grow in Japan. Right. It's a swamp, not because Christians can't live there, but because church buildings can't be built there because they'll be torn down. And so that was one element that I don't know how much that was in the forefront of the mind of Endo, who was a Catholic, Japanese Catholic or
very much as what I understand, because he I guess he said it even more than once that he had a certain level of worry, disdain, but he uses that swamp language more than one time. So it was definitely something that he held his homeland accountable for. Now, realize the Portuguese were literally the first Christian missionaries to come into Japan in that regard. And so Christianity would have been understood in a very Catholic way there, which is again just fine. And it wasn't until the late 1800s, the modern age, maybe when Japan starts to become more and more secular, and then even after World War II, where Christianity makes any headway at all, and it's still 1% Christian. It's a very, very small number. But so there's how they understand, and I think I even explained in the film that the Japanese really didn't understand Christianity, and maybe the Christians didn't understand the Japanese all that well either. And you had these conflicts of culture as much as you had conflicts of faith. Of course, it's going to be the primary focus because it's more easily discerned, more easily seen in the contrasts of what Jesus is versus Buddha and things of that nature.
It's worth noting, though, that the Japanese, despite what they believed, did not actually stamp out Christianity.
No.
Yeah, and it survived underground until it was finally allowed to sort of come out into the open, a few hundred years later. Yeah, it's kind of a anyway. So I did want to. One thing I thought you might have an interesting thought on, small discussion of this concept of relative truth. The Inquisitors claim that Christianity may be true in Portugal, but not in Japan. And Rodriguez reasons that if a thing is not true everywhere, it's not true at all. And I wondered how you felt watching that, sort of as an apologist. I'm sure that,
I
some thoughts on
watched
this
that.
notion of relative truth.
That was that. There were some scenes where I expected the stock answer, where Kikuchiro comes to ask for repentance, maybe that third time, and I expected Garfield's character to narrate over top of it, the voiceover to say, well, Jesus 70 times 7, how many times should we forgive her? That didn't play out, which was interesting. He just kind of did it, but you could tell he was hesitant to do it. But at the same time, when he offered that argument to the Inquisitor, it was interesting, because even after that, he says, what, you have no answer? It's like, and basically, so we're just going to disagree then, is what it comes down to. And that was the only point in the film, I think, where Rodriguez bested the Inquisitor. I think that was the only spot where he left him tongue-tied, which I thought was fascinating. So I love that idea, and that's one of those pieces that's so brief, but it's in need of teasing out more. And this is why what I like to do with films in general is to sit down and watch them, but then let's have a piece of pie and a cup of coffee, and let's talk about what did you think about that one point? So rather than saying, well, I'm going to take someone to this film in order to change their faith, I want to take someone to a film and talk about one idea and see if that one idea can be, where does that fit? Does that help draw them closer to Christianity, or is the filmmaker trying to lead them maybe farther away? Does it fit within your broader worldview? Does it make sense? And things like that. And I think that's a excellent little synopsis of how we can do that.
It's interesting. You kind of talked about the stock answers and things like that. It makes me think about how in a lot of Christian movies, there'll be a reference to scripture or some theological principle that feels kind of rehearsed and kind of heavy-handed and overly explicit. Whereas in this film, and even you can go back and read, Nietzsche or some of these atheists and, from 100, 200 years ago. And what's fascinating is they're so thoroughly soaked in scripture as just a sort of kind of background knowledge that they have, that it's not necessarily something they just quote when they're trying to make some specific explicit theological point. It's something that comes out of them.
Yeah.
And you get a strong sense watching this film that there are all these allusions to scripture. There are occasional references to scripture, but they're not necessarily heavy-handed. It's not like I'm going to quote this now for this specific point. It just sort of comes into regular conversation. It flows in and out because they're just saturated in it.
Yeah,
it's fascinating to me how we've lost that.
Right, and you almost sometimes, even when you're talking with other believers, when they start doing that, you're starting to say, okay, are you just trying to put on your Christianese, to sound holy or to sound wise or something like that? Yeah. So right, it should be natural. It should be if you're living it, it will come out.
Sure.
And you don't have to work at it. And that's one of the big differences between the Christian movie and the non-Christian movie, in the sense of one that's kind of, at least up to this point, those movies that are made by Christians for a Christian audience. It was one of the reviews of Silence I thought was fascinating, where on Rotten Tomatoes, the critics said, unless you're one of the faithful and have an interest in the internal workings of faith, this is just a long slog for us. So it's like, and I can see that. I can get, if you don't understand what faith is and what motivates an individual to suffering for his beliefs, if you're a pragmatist and you're a dyed-in-the-wool secular pragmatist, this film is going to make no sense to you whatsoever. It's going to be just a log slog of people talking to each other, and you're going to leave the theater scratching your head. And maybe that's why it didn't do, didn't have a box office bonanza. Maybe it was too Catholic for the evangelicals to care about. I don't know what the case is, but I thought it was a more real reflection, and how it should really kind of reflect that a little bit more.
And I mean, watching it, and I managed to see it in the theater, but it took me a while. I had to find one and managed to get there at the right time, because it didn't play for very long, and didn't play very close to me either. Yeah. But watching it, it's a really beautiful film. I mean, it's absolutely stunning to watch.
It won an Academy Award, right? For cinematography.
Well, it was at least nominated. Did it actually win?
Let me look. I'm not sure. I thought it might have. So
it was nominated for cinema. It was the only nomination it got was for cinematography. I think it deserved more, but at the very least, I mean, it was almost like that was a give me. It had to at least be nominated for it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it is absolutely beautiful to watch.
Yeah, it looks great. It really does. So,
but in a very kind of dark and brooding sort of way. I mean, it's. Anyway,
yeah, it did win.
Yeah, it's
yeah, and the 89th Academy Awards, it won Best Cinematography. So,
oh, it won. Okay, well, that's good. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, but man, yeah, it's in the Shack. I mean, the Shack is brighter overall. It's the Shack. A lot of it felt very computer generated. There's some scenes that are darker, like before when he gets to the Shack, before he sort of it's transformed. For him to sort of see God, it feels kind of dark, and then it sort of becomes this very bright place, and there's a sort of garden, right. And I mean, aesthetically, it is something to look at in a lot of places, yeah, I don't know. It felt a little somehow more hollow though at the same time.
Yeah,
some
of the approaches were very kind of again like stock, or I mean, the scene where he and Jesus are running on the water or walking on the water kind of thing. It just that kind of, well, that's been done. And it's been done in comedies as much as it's been done, and so even the idea isn't new. And then to film it, from they shot it from below, of course, and then they shot it. It wasn't anything new and interesting. The shots seemed to just serve up as a stage for the performance, but they weren't works of art in and of themselves.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to say it. That it kind of it's about carrying you through. I wanted to kind of discuss one more thing at the very least about silence, and then it might be cool to just sort of comparison and the sort of discussion of Christian versus secular and that kind of thing. The central idea I kind of feel like in the film is what does it actually mean to follow God? And evangelicals watching the film may not necessarily get the significance of the icon, but at the very least, they would, I think, be troubled by this notion that Rodriguez feels that it's more loving to save the lives of these Christians and then pretend to be a Buddhist and, not preach the gospel, not evangelize, and sort of let the church die, so that he saved some lives, but you could argue that some souls were lost in the process.
Right.
Watching it, how did you feel about that? And I can't help but wonder how Shusaku Endo felt about it as he was writing it.
I'm curious about that as well, because I thought that did leave a big question mark in the film, and that's one major point that it just didn't resolve. I don't think it did a good. I don't know that he was trying to resolve it. I think he wanted to ask the question and tease out possible answers, but I don't know that he resolved it in and of itself, because there's just too much tension there. At one point, Garfield quotes Tertullian, right? He says the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and the more, and they agreed with him. They said, we found the more people that we martyr, it doesn't work. They just keep growing. It has the opposite effect. So there are hints in there that martyrdom is the preferred way that Christianity has flourished, especially in non-Christian areas and in non-Christian life. This is how the church has grown. And the fact it almost wonder that is one of the messages Endo is saying is by their apostasy, they actually thwart that growth, because now there is no more martyrdom, which means there is no more seed. Well, and I don't know that he's trying to say that explicitly, but it's again, it offers an interesting question.
It does. Well, and so, Christ seemingly calls out from the icon and says to stand, because that was the reason he came into the world. And There's this idea that Christ identifies with suffering. And in that moment, I think it's very easy to say, okay, that makes sense. Save some lives, and maybe that's worth it. But as far as living out his life as a secret Christian and being a pagan on the outside, you wonder, whose life did that save beyond his own? Was that an act of love for others, or was that? I mean, you wonder, are you supposed to view that as one and the same action with the original sort of pseudo apostasy?
Right, because
I think you could distinguish them.
Well, especially because he talks to Ferrera after Ferrera apostatized, and it's not merely that he himself stamped on the icon. He's writing a book to talk about all the flaws of Christianity, right? And that's a big deal now. It's grown. It's gotten, as sin does, as a little compromise does. It leads you to compromise in more areas, justify those additional compromises with the same logic that you did the initial, and it continues on from that. And
well, and Neeson plays Ferrera as genuinely ashamed. Is kind of how I saw it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the hint was that he was, as Rodriguez was, a secret Christian, because there's a couple of times that he says "our Lord."
Yeah,
and I noticed that specifically in the second time he does it. Rodriguez calls him on it. Says, "Well, you said our Lord." Oh, maybe I misspoke. He's trying to. Well, maybe. What do you mean, maybe? So.
There was something that Mokichi, one of the Christians that Rodriguez interacts with in one of the villages, asks Rodriguez before he's going forward to sort of turn himself into the Japanese to protect the priests.
Uh-huh.
And it's a question about faith. Rodriguez tries to sort of encourage him in his faith. And Mokichi asks, "My love for God is strong. Could that be the same as faith?" And I wonder if that could be sort of an interpretive key with Rodriguez. That Rodriguez, his heart and his intention is to act out of love for God, love for these Japanese. He may not have the faith, the strength of faith and conviction to live that out with, total bravery and uncompromising, an uncompromising approach or whatever, but his love is there. And you get the feeling that maybe that's where Kichichiro, who is sort of the betrayer, the Judas figure, who is sort of a Christian, he has to continue to ask, for forgiveness, and to confess his sins to Rodriguez. But you feel like maybe that's Koichichiro's situation, that he actually at the end of the film he's found with a Christian image on his person,
right?
When he's supposed to be living sort of as a pagan, and so he's martyred as a Christian. Presumably, he's taken away, and you don't know if he's killed or not.
That's
presumably
right.
He is.
Yeah,
but it's interesting that he actually is martyred, whereas Rodriguez is not.
Yes, that's what I saw in the film, is the primary contrast between Rodriguez, who initially is so strong in his faith and continues to go down that path, but ultimately becomes an apostate every way, shape, and form other than perhaps internally. Versus Kichijiro, who outwardly does it, I'm weak, denies it, but comes back, denies it, but comes back, denies it, but comes. So he keeps living a Christian life until he gets caught and then denies it, but then he goes back and tries to live the Christian life again. Initially, and this is one of the geniuses of the film, is you are supposed to disdain Kichijiro. You're supposed to look upon him as this weak, mealy-mouthed guy, but at the end, he's still living his faith and Rodriguez isn't. So who actually is the weak one? I find it it's really an interesting comparison between the two figures.
Well, particularly because Rodriguez fashions himself as Jesus and Koichiro as Judas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he uses some of that language. Yes, what you do quickly. Yeah. Says those kinds of.
Well, did you want to maybe move on to just talking a little bit about comparing the films and that kind of thing?
Sure. I would say one thing at the end, though, on Silence. I'm brought to an idea in John 15 that where Jesus tells his disciples, if the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of this world, I chose you out of the world. Therefore, the world hates you. Right. And that's and he goes on to say, they're going to persecute you, and he says, but when the Helper comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who proceeds from the Father, he will bear witness about me, and you also will bear witness because you have been with me from the beginning. So there's an idea in the Gospels that bearing witness is a reflection of your faith. And so my theology argues that while there are those who may apostatize and live as secret Christians, they are more of the Lots of the world, living in Sodom and not living a fulfilled Christian life. Whereas, you let it's difficult, but you let God deal with the martyrdom, and you stay faithful to your witness. It seems that's the message, at least the biblical message, that I get from the scripture.
One thing about the whole notion, the whole idea of a Christian film versus a non-Christian film or a secular film or whatever, I did want to note one theme that seems to be in both films, which has to do with Christ's identification with the suffering and the weak. Because that does ring in both films. It's definitely stronger in Silence, but I think the idea of nail marks on Papa's arms and in the shack, Papa talks about identifying with Missy, not leaving her. There's this kind of identification of God sort of suffers with the suffering. It's not as central as a theme, but it's definitely there. And I wondered, because that is sort of a point of comparison or something that's shared between the two films. How did you feel about how both films address that point?
Well, obviously, it's more explicit in The Shack in the sense that he says it, right? Mm-hmm. Or the script, the dialogue.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, because nothing's implicit in The Shack in a sense, because everything's on the sleeve, on the nose.
Exactly. In Silence, at the beginning, Andrew Garfield, and maybe it's a bit of Chekhov's gun, but he says, I wonder if when he first sees the Japanese Christians being martyred, he goes, I wonder if I could have their faith. I wonder if I could stand their martyrdom. And but you see him through most of the film grow in his conviction and his defiance of the Inquisitor. It's only again when he's faced with the death of others in unspeakable suffering and unspeakable horrors that he then starts to think that he's heard from Jesus and recants, because he's doing the thing that Jesus himself came on earth to do. So I think that we you get a feeling that God is there. There's just a general feeling of holiness, and I appreciate that, because while the shack says I'm with her in her suffering, I think silence displays it better. You feel God there. You feel that this is a holy moment, that these people who are dying for their faith are dying for something real, and they're dying for something good. And while you can despise the inquisitor and his torturers, there is something of significance going on. And even though the evil is being perpetrated, you can see that God is being glorified in the midst of it. I don't see that in the shack. I hear it. They talk about it, but you don't ever experience it in that same way. It removes you out of the shack. You tend to walk, you almost start to reflect, well, what about my problem here? Does this, that doesn't mean God, that makes me feel better, because I'm going to say that God believes in me and he's going to work it out. And it makes you feel better in the sense that you're thinking that God's going to pay attention to me and my problems now. That's the attitude that you get coming out of the shack. Coming out of silence, the attitude that you get is the Hebrews chapter 11, the martyrs of whom the world was not worthy, right? Men who suffered by being cut in two, by being torn apart, by, all of whom the world was not worthy. That's the feeling that you get. Not, I want to be those guys. You may want to be Mac and have a weekend with God, but you definitely don't want to be a Japanese martyr, although you sense that they're closer to God than you'll ever be. So.
Well, and I wonder, I think you seized on something there as far as the way this notion is presented. In silence, you see the suffering, you sort of see the banality of evil, that it's sort of this bureaucratic process. Yeah, exactly. And you also see, Andrew Garfield's, deep personal relationship with Jesus. And in the shack, all you see is Max suffering, and whatever happens to Missy is presented as somehow otherworldly. It seems so cruel and so wicked and so evil, but it's not something you can even catch a glimpse of. So it kind of makes it, your imagination, sort of runs wild, and it sort of becomes, something that's so terrible that there's no possible excuse that God could have for not stopping it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It becomes almost cartoonish in that regard. Yeah.
So, yeah. And I think that's a good point, that with silence, you're able to put yourself in this position of suffering, maybe in a way that feels more real. Able to sort of follow the logic of this notion, that Christ identifies with the suffering, when you can kind of identify with the suffering. I think there's always something about us that there's something about when we hear about the suffering of others, that it hits us in a way that our own suffering doesn't, at least in theory.
Right.
Kind of moving on to this sort of just the aesthetic quality, the way that these things are presented as far as just their execution. How would you compare The Shack and Silence?
Well, I mean, obviously Scorsese's a master. He's, nobody doubts his creative filmmaking, that he's one of the top directors doing it. Mm-hmm. So it's a little unfair to say, to pull up the guys from the minor leagues and to say, okay, you get to go against the superstar pitcher, and let's compare you guys. So I don't know if that's an adequate comparison or not, but I think, again, the biggest difference between the two is Scorsese allows questions to go unanswered. He doesn't wrap it all up in a nice, neat bow. And he lets the dialogue breathe and doesn't try to answer, although there's a lot of nuance there. He doesn't try to explain it, unpack it, and things like that. Those are the primary criticisms I have of, like I said, these Christian films where you would go a lot longer, you'd go a lot farther if you had some of these kinds of dilemmas where maybe not everybody ends up, you don't have what we call a Brady Bunch ending all the time. So
no, and I think you bring up a fair point about comparing, a fairly new director with Scorsese, and certainly I've seen a handful of indie films with new directors that I watched and thought, oh, there's this interesting idea here, but the execution was a little weak, and there was this problem here, and it is different, and I think that's fair. And it was kind of a film that Scorsese did that was kind of a bugaboo for evangelicals, The Last Temptation of Christ, which is still a movie that I watch and felt my faith deepened by. And so there's something that Scorsese is able to do, even with content that isn't so neat and cut and dry, that has problems.
Right.
And so that's a testament to his ability for sure. At the same time, although the Shack's director was kind of new, you also saw that there was money behind it. It was a very polished production, and
it made more money than Scorsese's did. I mean, I think the grosses for Silence were like $9 or $10 million, something, and it was a $50 million budget. It wasn't a huge budgeted film, but it was a pretty low grossing movie as compared to. I don't know that the Shack made a lot of money. I think it's still less than 100 million. Who knows what the DVD sales are doing for the thing, but
and perhaps a better comparison would be between the novels, the money and the star power and that kind of thing. And as far as that's concerned, they are very different books. And I would say honestly that, first of all, we've complained about The Shack a lot, but I would not say it was on the whole completely a terrible movie. I mean, I was surprised at places that I was connecting with it as much as I was.
Yeah.
A lot of it happens a lot less once they're in the Shack, but the subject matter, the material beneath the film is kind of where it's at. And in this case, you had a book that in the Shack that was, I would say, improved on in the film, but still failed to really do what I think a movie is supposed to do. It kind of felt like a dramatic sermon that might be preached in a kind of more progressive, kind of emergent type church.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Silence didn't feel like that. Silence felt like a work of cinematic art. I mean, I was affected by it consistently. There weren't really points where I felt pulled out of it. Shack a lot. There were a lot of places where I'd be watching The Shack and I'd be kind of in it, and then I'd feel myself pulled out, like, this is kind of stupid or whatever.
Yeah.
And I agree. I wasn't able to consistently go through it.
So and the director is a kind of a slave to his source material. Let's face it. Silence. It was a award-winning book. I mean, The Shack was originally self-published, so again, from the starting point, those are two different starting points, but again, I think it says something that I don't know anyone who's read the book Silence. How many Christians do you know who have read that, and how many Christians have read The Shack? So it says something about our modern day biases and what we value and how we read it. We want to know about my pain and me right now, in even though we're living in the most affluent time ever in the history of humanity, in probably the most affluent nation in the history of humanity, we're all worried about our pain. Where that's the thing that God has to answer, right? When I talk to atheists, they're all about that. Well, I don't like the way that he treats those people over there because that makes me feel bad about them, or all that kind of stuff seems to be where everyone's focus is, and it sounds good, but it's really, again, as you say, Silence gives you a whole different perspective on people, faith, and what it means to be holy and walking in your convictions.
Well, and to clarify the issue of budget and box office, Silence, as you said, had a budget of $50 million and earned 16. The Shack had a budget of 20 and earned 96. So it looks like Silence didn't turn a profit, and The Shack just about did 5 times more than its budget.
Which means that they'll make more like that. Because if you can do, anybody who can invest 20 million to make 90, they'll do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Absolutely.
the ultimate language of Hollywood. It's not Christian or secular, it's green. So
unless you had more thoughts, I might want to wrap up with just a question I'd be interested in getting your answer on, which is, as an apologist, I'm sure you have your own thoughts on the problem of evil. And so I was kind of curious as to how that issue, and then how you would look at these two films in relation to your answer to that question. And do either of them touch on that or that kind of thing?
Yeah, actually, and The Shack actually even leveraged the free will defense initially. When they start talking about human beings, and human beings have to make choices, you have to be able to love God. If you have to be able to love God, that means you're going to have to be able to turn away from God, right? Because love can never be compelled. You can't compel someone to love you. Love doesn't work that way. It has to be freely given. But if it's freely given, that means you have to have a choice between loving, which means, putting the other person above yourself, or putting yourself above the other person. And all sin ultimately becomes selfishness at some point. So I think the Shack talked about that to some degree. It didn't go far enough. It ignored natural evil completely. Just didn't even think about answering that question about, what about acts that are not necessarily attributable directly to mankind. So I was a little bit interested there. I think Silence colors our understanding of suffering in a different way, as opposed to thinking about suffering as something that happens to us and it's not fair to us in this world. Silence makes us start to think about, well, is the suffering of this world worthy to be compared to the graces that we get in the next world, right? Because he asks Father Rodriguez, this man, he's in paradise now, paradiso. I think a lady came to be baptize her baby. And she said, the baby will, if the baby dies, he'll be in paradise with Jesus, is my child, right? And the father agrees. It's typical, theological response of a 16th century or 1600 Catholic priest. But it makes us reshape the concept of evil, and it makes us understand that even the most holy can be put in a certain situation where evil, maybe the apostatizing of your faith itself, can flourish. That in an evil world, this was part of the whole concept of Japan being a swamp, that, what if it's so evil that the good can't flourish? What do we do in that? Of course, I don't buy that line. I think God can do anything, anywhere. It may take several hundred years, as it did, but it at least gives us a different understanding. What do you do with this? His response, I remember at one point Rodriguez's response was, yes, my life is in danger, but the joy that I receive from ministering to these simple Christians has more than compensated for my hiding in the hut and being fearful for my life. I do it all again, because even though I'm contained and I'm confined and I'm suffering, the joy of giving them hope in the gospel is worth it. And I think that's a very biblical understanding of suffering. Here's the ultimate thing that comes down, and this is the point that we see with the problem of the Japanese culture, is every worldview has to have an answer to the problem of evil and the problem of suffering, because it's a problem for everybody. It's not just a problem for the Christian. Mm-hmm. So the atheist can argue, well, where's your God? what about the child born with cancer? And say, oh, yeah, that's a good question. What about it? What do you say? What's the atheist answer to the child? Nature is red in tooth and claw, survival of the fittest, and oh, well, you're done. What else can you say if there's no God and we're all here by accident? The Buddhist, the panentheist, the person who says that we're all just part cogs within the greater machine of the world, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Some of them will say evil is merely an illusion. They'll doubt the existence of evil, right? And this is a typical Vedanta Buddhist approach that says you have the yin and the yang. In every light there's a little evil, in every evil there's a little light. It's all in balance. What you have to do is learn to ignore those things, and you'll become as a candle that has been blown out. You'll cease to feel it at all, and that's your state of nirvana. So evil is merely illusory. It's up to you to withdraw and reflect and meditate inside yourself until you feel nothing, and ignore it. So it's either oh well, evil is there. You can ignore evil, or you can try to conquer evil, which will never happen. Christianity says, no, there is one who knows evil, who can defeat evil, who has experienced evil. We are the only faith where God comes down and firsthand experiences the ramifications of evil and suffering. He is a God who suffers, which is one of the things that the Shack actually does get right. That God himself takes part in humanity and experiences the evil in our stead so that we may be free. And because of that, we can understand that there is an existence coming where there will be no more evil. Now, will that be for everyone? I don't necessarily believe so. But I say that the problem of evil is answered, the problem of suffering is answered in the fact that in this world you have tribulation, but Jesus has overcome this world. And that the sufferings of this present age are not worthy to be compared to the glories that are to come. Yes, there is suffering here, but what we see is Christianity reflects both in Christ's suffering and in the joy that the martyrs take in going to their own deaths for the next world, that the sufferings of this age are just simply not worthy to be compared to that which is ahead of us.
Good thoughts. Now, if somebody wanted to learn more about you, what would be the website?
Go to www.comereason.org, and or you can follow me on Twitter at Come Reason, or Facebook, or everything is Come Reason. So Instagram, Come Reason, YouTube, all over the place. But the website has the most information and blog posts and links to all the other things. That would be a good thing. You sign up for the newsletter, all kinds of stuff over there. And we'll put speaking engagements and stuff like that up as well.
Well, you also have a podcast, and if somebody were to
have
their iPhone out or whatever and wanted to pull up iTunes or Podcast Republic or whatever, what's the name of the podcast?
Yeah, the podcast is Come Let Us Reason Together. And we put out a new edition every Sunday. And or you can go to podcast.comereason.org. That's the web address, and you can find the RSS feed there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lenny. I really appreciate you doing this with me, and it was fun talking with you.
Thanks, Cody. I appreciate it. Talk to you soon. La 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 la.